We acknowledge that Indigenous people are the traditional and ancestral guardians of this land that we now call Canada, and we come with respect for this land and for the people who have and do reside here. That this land remains unceded everywhere, while acknowledging that inherent and treaty rights exist, and that the promises in those treaties must be acknowledged and fully upheld. That all Canadians have a duty to acknowledge their relationship to the land upon which they live and work, and to prioritize initiatives that support reconciliation with local Indigenous communities. That the keepers of traditional Indigenous knowledge in every community are worthy of honor, consideration, and respect. That courageous Indigenous leaders, young and old, deserve the ongoing support of all Canadians to create equal opportunities for everyone of this land. That reconciliation will be successful when all Canadians have committed to learning about our shared past, listening to Indigenous truths, and pursuing a new and more inclusive, collaborative, and respectful path toward a better future.
I acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Ojibwe, the Wendake Nyawentsio, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee. I honor and appreciate this ancestral relationship and hope to walk with peace and allyship with the people who currently reside here and honor those First Nations who have provided stewardship over this land since time immemorial. These lands were covered by the Williams Treaties, and I recognize that the promises and provisions of those treaties have not been upheld by the colonial government. It is my responsibility to reflect and live by these words. Why would we do a land or territory acknowledgement? We're certainly used to seeing and hearing them now, and we recognize they're a politically correct thing to do. But is there really full understanding of why they are being done and why we see and hear them so often now? And most importantly, why are they important to do? A key point about land or territory acknowledgements is that they are primarily done by settlers for settlers. It's a way for settlers to acknowledge some of the different and complex historical bases that have brought us to the point of needing to do land or territory acknowledgements. One of the things that acknowledgements are intended to accomplish is directly confront and reject historical colonial justifications for colonization. Two of these were the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. The doctrine of discovery is just what it sounds like, a legal justification provided by the Church that declared that Europeans were allowed to discover what is now called North America, also called Turtle Island by many First Nations, and other non-Christian lands and claim them for the Crown. Terra nullius literally means empty or uninhabited land. This was the second main legal construct that was used to justify colonialism, taking of land, and the oppression, genocide, and cultural genocide of the original inhabitants of this land. That the land was uninhabited and undiscovered has been disproven beyond any doubt, even by Eurocentric standards, as archaeological evidence has shown ongoing habitation of lands for thousands into tens of thousands of years, well before anyone from the Norse world or Europe came to what we now call North America, or as First Nation and Inuit often say, since time immemorial. Both of these, the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, are far in the past, so one might question why we still need to confront and reject them. There are colonial constructs and mindsets that grew out of these historical principles that still to this day support ongoing oppression, unequal opportunities and outcomes, and sustained genocide of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. It is these current constructs, beliefs, structures, and acts and regulations that the acknowledgement is intended to confront and reject. Land or territory acknowledgements also recognize the historic rights and title that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have to the land or territory being acknowledged. Because the original basis of colonization was built on false beliefs and claims, the historical rights and titles need to be recognized as still existing. Acknowledgements move into the realm of reconciliation by speaking to the need to change the current colonial laws, policies, norms, and belief systems that still negate Indigenous title and rights and still serve to oppress First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Land or territory acknowledgements are meant to help keep First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues and voices raised up in the collective consciousness, and to remind everyone that there is much we have lost by silencing and oppressing First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We want to ensure that their strengths, values, and voices are heard, and that their norms are accepted instead of being silenced, as is the goal of cultural genocide and ongoing oppression. If you are the person that has been tasked with doing a land or territory acknowledgement, and you're just reading what you've been given, or you don't understand the history and reason behind what acknowledgements are and why they are being done, we sincerely ask that you take the time to educate yourself on the history and current situation in the area you are doing the acknowledgement for, and reach at least some level of understanding of the need for them. The reason for doing one should be understood, considered, researched, and come from a sincere personal belief in what one is doing and saying. You see here a map of all the territories that existed in what we now call Canada prior to colonization by Europeans. You will note there is a lot of overlap as territories were fluid and changing for many reasons. All of what we now call Canada was inhabited by First Nations or Inuit, including the far north. In contrast, this is a map from Indigenous Services Canada showing the current First Nations reserves in Canada. Out of the landmass of approximately 2.5 trillion acres, only about 0.36% is allocated as reserve land for First Nations, and small amounts also set aside for Métis and Inuit. Statistics support that much of the land set aside was land deemed unusable or poor, land settlers didn't want. Some of what are called modern-day treaties have changed the percentage of land to some degree, most notably the agreement governing Nunavut, but again in an area with very low colonial population base. On reserve land, the land is not owned by the nation, community, or individual living on it, but rather by the federal government. Therefore, First Nations on reserve cannot earn equity on their home, use it as collateral, sell it to anyone of their choice, or bequeath it to their children or anyone else. First Nations can own land, but it must be off reserve and then is treated as anyone else who owns property with all the associated taxes and other requirements and responsibilities. The difference between these two maps is very stark and highlights the gross inequity between pre- and post-colonization, and is a very stark visual demonstration of why acknowledgements are still so important today. We've learned now why land or territory acknowledgements are so important, but how do we go about finding out the information to do one correctly and with the knowledge that is needed? There are some great online resources like www.native-land.ca or similar that can help research some historical territories, keeping in mind that territories were fluid, and especially in some areas such as what is now called BC, there are a lot of overlapping territories for even one very specific location. So these websites may be a good start, but they are only a start and do not address the need for a personal connection to your local community. To begin that personal connection and conversation on your local level, a great place to start is a local or regional friendship center. The National Association of Friendship Centers has a map which can be used to search for the one closest to your location. They're a good place to start asking questions about history and both whom to approach in the local community or communities and the correct protocol for these approaches. They often offer classes, groups, and opportunities that are open to both Indigenous and settler people. Once you have found out some basic information, you can start to approach people in your local area to find someone who can assist in guiding you to craft a truly authentic and meaningful acknowledgement. In general, copying and pasting of a city or town's acknowledgement isn't considered best practice, as they are often very basic and sometimes even wrong. Universities are better, but again, doing this defeats the purpose of understanding and creating those personal and local connections, and it is those local connections that are important to focus on. A very important note. At Sarvac, we state in our national acknowledgement that all of what is now called Canada is unceded. At the same time, we are very aware that treaties were signed that technically did cede land in the colonial sense. However, from all we have heard and listened to, and we have tried hard to not just listen but truly hear, and all we have researched, there were many issues with the treaties that we believe are grounds for saying the land remains unceded. For all the reasons that follow, and we recognize that they are generalities and will not apply to every treaty signed nor every situation, but they are universal enough for us to stand by our position and statement. Firstly, most treaties were first discussed and agreement reached orally with the nation, confederacy, or other group involved. Once these oral agreements were settled, a written document was prepared by the European colonists and signed by the nation or confederacy's representative. However, much of the time, what was written was not what was discussed and agreed to orally. The treaties where this occurred were not negotiated with honesty and good faith on the colonial side, negating the understanding and intent agreed to by the nation or confederacy. Secondly, to fully understand ceding of land, one must have a colonial understanding of ownership, rights, and title. From what we understand, most Indigenous parties to these treaties, most First Nations, did not have this colonial understanding, and from their perspective, treaties were an agreement to share resources side by side, not a complete waiving of all rights and title, which seems to be the predominant European perspective. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the spirit of the promises in the treaties, and for the most part the promises themselves, have not been kept to by the colonial government. This has been proven out many times in modern-day court cases where the government has been proven in court to have violated these promises and agreements in the treaties. So for all these reasons, we do say that land in what we now call Canada is unceded, while also very much recognizing that treaties did and do exist, and supporting the efforts to have the original oral and understood basis of these treaties upheld. For those modern treaties that include land title, the land is also unceded as it has been returned to the Indigenous title that it belongs to. I'd like to share an example here of a First Nations-based, thoughtful, and comprehensive territory acknowledgement from the Canada Council for the Arts. The Canada Council for the Arts acknowledges that our offices, located in Ottawa, are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. The Council recognizes the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voices and values of our host nation. Further, the Council respects and affirms the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. The Council has and will continue to honor the commitments to self-determination and sovereignty we have made to Indigenous nations and peoples. The Council acknowledges the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and the original peoples in what we now know as Canada, and fervently believes the arts contributes to the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. This land acknowledgement was developed by members of the Algonquin community, and we thank them for their generosity and collaboration. The resources here are intended to help you on your personal journey in creating your own understanding of acknowledgements, local information on traditional territories, and where and how to start reaching out to make those vital local connections so you can provide a meaningful, thoughtful acknowledgement.